أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
May peace and blessings be upon you all. Today, first of all, I would like to thank everyone for coming, and we are going to start with the recitation from the Quran, which is how we start all of our events because we like to remember God before we start.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر والملائكة والكتاب والنبيين وآتى المال على حبه ذوي القربى واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل والسائلين وفي الرقاب وأقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة والموفون بعهدهم إذا عاهدوا والصابرين في البأساء والضراء وحين البأس أولئك الذين صدقوا وأولئك هم المتقون. صدق الله العظيم.
And the meaning is, righteousness is not that you turn your faces towards the east or the west, but true righteousness is in one who believes in Allah, the last day, the angels, the books, and the prophets, and gives both in spite of love for it to relatives, orphans, the needy, the traveler, those who ask for help, and for praying slaves, and who establishes prayer and gives zakat, those who fulfill their promise when they promise, and those who are patient in poverty and hardship enduring them. Those are the ones who have been true, and it is those who are the righteous. Tonight we have with us Brother Edmund Arroyo, who will be speaking about an Islamic perspective of social justice. He is a licensed clinical social worker and licensed school social worker. He is also the founder of the Heart Speak Institute, which provides counseling for families, couples, and children.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. In the name of God, most merciful and kind, and with blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad and his families and companions. I want to thank you for inviting me, and one of the things that I want to concentrate on or start with is just the concept of ideal versus reality. And very often when we talk about our religion, anybody talks about their religion, whether it be a Christian or a Muslim, a lot of times we talk about the ideal, right? We're like this. So like I could say, in Islam, we pray 5 times a day, and alhamdulillah, we can connect to our Creator 5 times a day. That's what makes it special. But let's talk about the reality that, if we survey Muslims across the country, how many of them are actually praying 5 times a day. So there's the ideal of what we should be doing, and there's the ideal of what really happens out there in practical terms because of our weaknesses as human beings. And so when it comes to societies as well, we look at what we consider Muslim countries, there's the ideal of what Islam teaches, and then there's the reality of what's actually being practiced in those countries. Very often you find that culture will trump what the religion teaches. So I just wanted to open up with that because I'm going to talk a lot about our ideals, and a lot of people may wonder, especially non-Muslims, like, well, that's not what I see, and that's sad, but that is the case sometimes. And that what our religion asks us to do, or what our religion teaches us to do, isn't always the case. So let's talk about the concept of social justice. Justice in general refers to the individual, kind of like what's morally right. When we talk about social justice, it implies more to how responsibility is divvied up in society. So the burdens and also the responsibility, but also the rewards is divvied up in society. So when we talk about social justice, we look more at groups of people. But before we go too much into social justice in Islam, I want to talk a little bit about just sociology and our connection as human beings, because that's my profession. That's what I deal with on a daily basis. And one of the things that's important for us to understand social justice and how we actually apply that as human beings, wherever we are in the world, largely depends on how we connect to other people and our empathy and how we look out for other people. So how can I look out for my sister here if I can't connect with her and understand her as a human being? Then how can I connect to her culture as a group or her gender as a group and have empathy for them and then stand up for social justice in that regard? So one of the challenges we have to that nowadays is the electronic culture that we have. And in my office, one of the most common challenges in mental health that people deal with in America is depression. And you know, the number one characteristic of somebody who's depressed is that they say they feel lonely. Okay, so think about that for a minute in regard to social connection, because now we're moving towards a society where we are very much in contact with people electronically. And Facebook and all these other things, I'm not dogging Facebook, I think it can be a good thing, you know, but all these connections that we have electronically. I'll give you an example. Like, I get someone come to my office, and I work in a public school, so I can get a young lady come to my office, and she could say, yeah, so I broke up with my boyfriend last night. And I'd say, okay, you're upset, what happened? And she tells me about this hour-long conversation that they had, and at the end of it, there was this breakup, and there was this upset, and all these nasty things were said to each other. And then, through my conversation with her, I started realizing that they actually never said a word to each other. That this was all done through the phone, through texting. Okay? And so, what we find is that people are having these relationships where, you know, it's all an electronic relationship. And it's not uncommon for me to hear where people have an electronic relationship and they earn trust with somebody online, and then they meet with them the first time they do things that they normally would never do with anybody when they meet them the first time. But for some reason, this connection electronically made them feel like they actually had a human connection to this person. And so, you know, when you have the phenomenon of teenagers, and you guys can probably relate to this as well, in that the phenomenon that your phone is like your third arm. And if someone tries to take it from you, you feel lost in life. You know, I know this because I have a teenage daughter. If I threaten to take her phone, she think that I'm trying to kill her. She gets, I can't understand it. And I'm like, do you understand if you just give me your phone for tonight, that like I'll give it back to you tomorrow? It's not the end of the world. And then it escalates, and then she loses her phone for a week and she doesn't get it. But it's you know, it's your connection to the world. But then my question is, are you really connecting to the people around you? So, for example, when it comes to your neighbors, right? In Islam, we have a responsibility to our neighbors. We have a moral responsibility to them. So now we start moving into this concept of social justice. If I have a moral responsibility to my neighbors, I must first know them. I must know their name, their first and their last name, and talk to them occasionally, so that if they're wrong in some way, I feel a connection to them and the need to defend them. But, you know, let's go back 50 years ago where everybody had their porches on the front of their house, and they would sit on their porches and they would talk to each other, and their kids would play together. And eventually, about 20 years ago, the porches moved to the back of the house, and they're called decks, surrounded by these big fences. And people weren't interacting, and they don't know their neighbors. They barely wave to them. During this big snowstorm, was one of the few times that neighbors actually interacted a little bit because my neighbor had a snowplow and I didn't. And so I said, "How you doing?" And, I'm sure she'll listen and talk to them. But one of the things I try to do is make a big connection with my neighbors, but sometimes when there's a catastrophe, all of a sudden people, they will try to connect. But if there's not, and we see that, for example, in America, when 9/11 happened, there's a catastrophe and everybody rallies together. We saw that in World War II. There's a catastrophe and everybody rallies together. And now, we also try to connect in a hurry so that we can defend against a common enemy towards some kind of social justice. But sometimes then it's skewed because, we call it patriotism, but then are we really applying some kind of social justice, or are we just trying to gain revenge of some sort? And so I want you all to consider that and consider your connection to other people and your connection to humanity. And some scholars will say that you cannot connect with God unless you can connect with a human being first. So if I can't understand a person, and if I can't understand how she works or he works or relate to him or find happiness in him or her and provide an interaction that's mutually beneficial, how can I then connect vertically to God? And how am I supposed to understand the creator of heaven and earth if I can't even connect to other human beings? So we have that responsibility first. There's a big movement in marriage counseling that is based on the concept of empathy. And one of the things that they say is that one of the problems we have why the divorce rate is so high is as human beings, we're losing empathy for other human beings. The lack of the ability to understand where they're coming from, to understand their perspective without first going into our world. So there's this activity that I do in marriage counseling where it's like, okay, I want you to shut up. Okay, let's say, my wife's name is Mara, so let's say we're in counseling. I'll say, okay, Mara, you're going to Edmund's world, and you're not going to think about yourself at all. You're just going to try to understand his world. It's like you're kind of walking into his room or his house for the first time. And just if you walk to someone's house for the first time, and they say, "Oh yeah, it's a beautiful painting," you're not going to say, "Oh well, you shouldn't hang it there." You're not going to criticize where they hung the painting. You're just going to say, "Oh," and you're going to just admire their house. Well, it's the same kind of thing. Because we lack this empathy, we rarely go into our own selfish world. And so we have a society that's raised, and some of it's, it's not all bad, but individualistic thought. What am I getting out of this deal? And we carry that into our relationships in our life, and not just, we go in our work relationships. So, about 15 years ago, large companies started to notice this, and so they started creating team models in their companies. And everybody's part of a team now because they started realizing that everybody was moving toward this individualistic idea of work and what am I getting out of this deal? How am I comparing to the next person? So when, and actually in the Quran there's a verse that says, surely man transgresses when he thinks himself self-sufficient. And so when we talk about our social obligation, even in Greek tradition and historically in Greek society, the concept of the village idiot, idioto is where the word comes from, idiot, is the person who isolates themselves and who doesn't interact with people, or when they go out in social gatherings, they don't interact with other people. They just kind of, they don't make eye contact and they don't interact with other people. So this is a concept that a lot of people throughout history have identified as something that could be a problem in humanity. Now, when we talk about Islamic law, and how does it fit in Islam? How does it fit into social justice? We need to consider that there are 5 main goals of Islamic law, and every one of them has to do with social justice. The first one is the preservation of family. The second one is the preservation of life, not in any particular order, but preservation of life, preservation of the economy, preservation of education, and preservation of religion. And it's pretty all-encompassing if you think about it. It's pretty all-encompassing of the different challenges we have in society. And the preservation of those things in Islam is the goal of the jurists who are trying to make legal decisions. Now, when I talk about the ideal versus the reality, I'm going to mention some things now that don't apply in some countries that are Muslim countries, because for whatever reason, the culture has trumped the religion. And, one of those concepts is the idea of education and the Muslim responsibility for education, for educating yourself. The first verse revealed to the Prophet Muhammad was Iqra. Some translate it as read, some as recite. When he heard it, peace be upon him, he said, but I don't know how to read. And a lot of scholars will say that this concept, along with many other parts of our religion, really, there's also a weak hadith where the Prophet said, seek knowledge even if it's in China. Meaning that if you have to go to the ends of the earth to get it. And many of our scholars throughout history have done that. And so we have this responsibility to educate. And there's nothing about not educating women. And you'll have some societies that will choose not to educate women. And most Islamic scholars today would argue against that and say that's ridiculous. And some scholars that I've discussed this topic with would say that that's part of the problem with the Muslim world. It's a breathing with one lung. Is that, there's this whole section of society that's not able to contribute, and that's what paralyzes some of the communities that are facing a lot of the social challenges they're facing. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he was sent as a mercy to mankind. That was the most common definition of him, is he was sent as a mercy to mankind. And some would argue that he also was sent as a marshal for injustice. One of the first things he did was outlawed the killing of female babies, because this was a tradition, we've also heard of it happening in China and some other countries, where people felt that there was no value in having a daughter born to you because it didn't bring prestige to the family, and it meant that you had to try to get her married, and all these other social challenges that they saw, and it was one of the first things he outlawed. Islam established for women the right to vote, which in this country was not established until about 60 years ago. The right to inheritance, and a lot of these other things that were established early on that were just revolutionary at the time. And these are things that the Prophet, peace be upon him, had to take a stand on. And when we talk about social justice, that's what we're talking about. Establishing rights and protecting looking out for people in society, especially who in that society are maybe don't have as much strength in that society. Now, some other examples of that would be the poor. This is really an amazing concept in Islam. In that, in Islam, charity is seen as my responsibility. It's not something. It's not seen as like a good deed necessarily. There is that. There's sadaqah, which is just kind of like giving as a good deed. But there's also zakat as my responsibility to the poor. Now, not only is it my responsibility, but it's also their right on me. So they have the right to ask me for money. It's not what I have in my life, the clothes on my body, the check that I get every month. That's all a gift to me. We see that as all from Allah, all from God. So for me to say that they don't have a right to my money, and actually we see it as they're not only the right, but their risk, like it was what was meant to come to them. So that's from God as well. So, and actually the proper etiquette of giving to the poor is giving so that their hand is on top, so they're not begging for it. So you give to them and they take as their right on you. So that's a proper, other means like etiquette in our religion for how to give to the poor. We have lots of different concepts like that. So that's another example of social justice where as Muslims, we have, the poor have a right over us, and we have an obligation, a moral obligation, going back to the concept of justice, to provide for them and to look out for them. The traveler, if you ever travel overseas, you can understand how difficult that can be. And I like to share this story about how I was born and raised non-Muslim. Went to Catholic school for a long time. I'm like third generation Mexican. And I went to Puerto Rico with my family 2 summers ago. And we went to a mosque, a local mosque, and this is one of the things that is beautiful about being Muslim. It opens the whole world to you. And I go to the mosque, and my mother-in-law was traveling with us, and she only eats what's called zabiha meat, which meat that was slaughtered in the proper way. And so she said, so we knew that if we wanted to eat meat there, we had to find some meat that was slaughtered in the proper way. Otherwise, we'd be eating fish the whole 2 weeks we were there. I like fish, but not that much. So we go to a local mosque and we put a little letter in the mailbox and we said, Assalamu alaikum, we're visiting. Is there somebody that can help us find some meat? Somebody calls us that night at like 8 o'clock. And it's a Palestinian man who doesn't speak any English. He speaks Arabic. I don't speak Arabic, but we both speak Spanish. So here I'm talking to this Palestinian guy in Spanish, and our only connection is that we're both Muslim. So he invites me to the mosque to pray Isha, the night prayer with him. And my family and I go, and we start talking, and I'm translating for my family in Spanish. And he tells me, I'm going to try to find some meat for you. So he's going through like his Rolodex in his mind. I know there's one guy, he has a restaurant, so he has chicken running around with chickens in his backyard. I think he'll slaughter some for you. Let me call him, So he's calling, I know this one guy. It's a little bit weird, but he slaughters his own lambs in his backyard, so let me call him. And he calls him, and sure enough, so he gives me a ride. So here I am driving at 10:30 at night with a total stranger I just met him an hour and a half before. To some guy's house I never met before. In Puerto Rico, a place I've never been before. Only because we're Muslim, and he's trying to help a traveler. And so when I get there, I go to pay the guy, and he says, no, he already paid me. And I said, what are you doing? I was like, I would have done this, I don't even going to pay for it. He's like, no, that's your risk, he says. That's what was coming to you from God, simply because you're a traveler, and then I get reward for it. He said, so if you want to give a donation to the mosque, you can do that, but that's between you and God. Okay? So even a traveler has a right over you in Islam. And the concept being that when you consider people like refugees or other people that travel, not always out of, this concept of us as Americans being able to travel with all kinds of money, this wasn't always the case throughout the history of the world. A lot of times people traveled as a way of living and trading. So that's another example. Your parents, and really what you're going to find is that social justice, when you talk about the concept, it's divvying up responsibility, burdens, and rewards in a way that makes sense, that helps society as a whole. And when you talk about parents, our parents, it's in the Quran that we have to be patient with our parents, especially in their old age. And if any of you have old parents, you understand that. Because, it's like, my grandparents, alhamdulillah, they're wonderful, but they just say things sometimes and they don't think about what they're saying or who it's going to offend. And one time my brother and my brother's married sisters. Okay, so my one younger brother brings his sister over and my grandmother goes, oh yeah, you're the pretty one. And other sisters standing right there. And then the other sister's like, oh, she's like, oh, they're trying to play it off. And then she goes, oh, I'm sorry. I just meant that, like, she's the pretty one. That made it a whole lot better, right? But that patience, like our parents had patience with our children, and with us when we were children. And so they have a right over us then when we become their caretaker in old age. It's a moral responsibility for us, and it's a moral responsibility as society to look out for the elderly. So there's another concept. The earth has a right over us in our religion. When we talk about social justice, the concept of planting so that the next generation can benefit from it, rather than just cutting down the trees for our own consumption. We pray with our forehead on the ground, and we pray by the movement of the sun, and that's what determines our prayer schedule. Our calendar year and our fasting is determined by the moon, and a lot of what we do within our religion is based on our connection to earth. We purify ourselves with water before our prayer, and then even if we don't have water available, we use dirt, and it's a kind of equalizing element. And one of the things, talking about the social connection, I recently went with my wife to a place there's a mosque in northern New Mexico. And one of the beautiful things about that mosque is you don't have cell reception, and we didn't have internet. So we had about 5 days during Ramadan, our holy month, to just connect, right? Connect with each other, with the group of people that were there, ask questions, talk about Islam, talk about the world around us, look at the stars like I've never seen before. If you don't understand why they call this the Milky Way, then you got to go out in the middle of the desert and look at the sky. Because I'm an outdoorsman, so I like going outside. And I thought I'd seen a lot of stars before, but when I was in this desert in Albuquerque, or north of Albuquerque, what happens is, the reason why they call it the Milky Way is because there's this band of, like, it looks like milk, through the middle of the sky, that's a bunch of stars. And it just looks like a cloud that goes like this across the sky. And so there's a connection. One beautiful story from that was we didn't even use our watches. We took our watches off, and we prayed by the sun, and we go outside, and there's a traditional way of telling with a stick how what time it is for prayer. And so we went out there, and the teacher, the sheikh that I was with, he was giving an adhan, right, the call to prayer. And right when he was finished, we were just standing there talking, and a hummingbird comes, and it just stopped, like 5 feet above our head, just standing, like, I said standing there, but the hummingbirds, the cool thing with them is they can sit still, like a bee or something. Like regular birds can't do that. And it just stopped staring at us for like 10 seconds. Then it went and stood on a branch. And, those kind of connections to the world around you, whereas we probably never would have seen that. And, you could make your own conclusions about what he was coming for. But, it's one of those things that, if you could connect to humanity and connect to your surroundings, you'll find your heart and your mind in a better place. So, the other aspect of that within our religion is that we have this responsibility to check the oppression of leaders. One of the things that, there's a story, and I don't know it word for word, but it was one of the companions of the Prophet after he had passed away, peace be upon him. And there was a battle, and one of the things he said about the West, and he's talking about the Europeans. He said one of their best qualities, amongst their best qualities, is that they check the oppression of kings. And so Muslims throughout the history have, the best of Muslims, have recognized the goodness in other people. And that's another responsibility we have as Muslims. And there's a couple of hadith about the oppression of kings. One being, oppressive ruler being in hell, and then also a righteous leader being in heaven. But as Muslims, and we see this great example of it, all praise to God, in Egypt recently, of checking the oppression of kings and people who are tyrannical leaders. And when we, and it's not just leaders of a country, it could be an MSA, it could be whatever, but we have this responsibility to speak out against it and speak out against wrongdoing. And the other thing, another example would be, what can appear to be sometimes hierarchy from an outside perspective isn't always the case. And what's fair isn't always equal, and what's equal isn't always fair. And so, for example, if you see an imam leading prayer, what a lot of people don't understand from outside is he's not necessarily a religious leader. He's leading prayer, and if he messes up in his prayer, we have a responsibility to correct him. But sometimes, you have the despot, the tyrannical leader, who doesn't ever want to be questioned. But we have that responsibility within our religion to question anything that's not right or morally correct. And unfortunately, you see that. I'll give you an example. Like, in Islam, when a man or woman get married, the woman has a right to a dowry. She has a right to a certain amount of money. Some scholars would say enough to support her should they ever get divorced for 1 year or 6 months, something like that. Okay? But if you look in some societies, like in India, for example, in a Muslim family in India, they just override that concept and they still stick to the Indian tradition where the woman has to pay the man. And that's an example of how sometimes in some Muslim societies, the culture will override the religion. And so a lot of people looking from outside can be like, that's not fair. And in India, it gets to be very large sums of money, which is totally against the Islamic concept as well, in that it's supposed to be conservative. So when it comes to social justice, we need to consider how can we have social justice if we can't connect each other on a human level? And how can we connect each other, how can we connect to God if we can't connect to other human beings? And so we need to be careful how much we get caught up in this concept of, the person who dies with the most toys wins. Getting the latest phone constantly, because all it does is distract us more. There's a lot of research out there now about distraction, because there's this myth that multitasking is a good thing, and we're being sold this concept that doing a lot of things all at once is really productive. It's great, but what they're finding is that it's very hard to do any one of those things really well then. And so when you look at some of the greatest thinkers throughout history, one of their practices was to go in isolation while they were thinking, or to concentrate on one topic for a long period of time. And some of the Greek philosophers would go and ask the same question to a bunch of people and just get all these answers and then contemplate it. And so when it comes to our connection to other people, what they're finding is that people of this generation, more so your generation than mine, are having this concept they call it a brownout, not a blackout, and the brownout has nothing to do with happening in our community. It's just this concept that we're doing all these things at once, that your brain just kind of shuts down. It's kind of like, I was thinking about it on the way here, driving in rush hour traffic. That's like the most inefficient use of your car because it's wear and tear on the car and you're using a lot of gas to go very short distances. And so the same concept is happening with us where you got your phone out and you're instant messaging and searching on the internet and you're trying to do your homework and study at the same time, that you're not giving anything your undivided attention. Our prophet, peace be upon him, was an archetype of connecting to people. And there's a hadith that would say that when the prophet, peace be upon him, when you talked to him, he made you feel like you were the only person in the world. That he would turn towards you, he'd make eye contact with you, and you feel like nobody else, he wasn't paying attention to anything else. And I question how many of us are able to do that. And I find it's hard for me. I'm a therapist, that's my job, right? To sit and look to people. And it's frustrating me because when my phone buzzes, it distracts me for like 15 seconds. Because it's like, oh, I want to just turn it off, and I just like should look what if it's my next client or late, and then I miss like the next 15 seconds of what they're saying. Okay? So what I try to do is I try to take it out of my pocket, so at least I don't feel it and hear it, and say, so I'll put it behind me. So maybe I just hear it, but so this connection to human beings and this concept of brownout, it's research on executive functioning and our ability to do things really well and what they're looking for in jobs. And are we going to be distracted? I keep thinking that there's Robert's rules for meetings. Well, I'm thinking like at corporate meetings, eventually what they're going to have to do is like everybody put the phone on the table in like some vibrating proof box so that we can all focus on this for 20 minutes without everybody getting all these buzzes in their pocket and looking down. Especially for your generation. I don't know how you're going to be able to do it. You guys get like 20 texts every 15 minutes. I probably get like maybe 1 an hour or something like that. But you guys get texts constantly. I don't know how you're going to be able to carry a job with your phone vibrating constantly in your pocket. It's going to be a challenge to concentrate. And so that's something that we need to consider. So when we take all this into consideration, we need to, I like to take a saying that was said by a guy named Abdullah ibn Mubarak. He was a scholar of Islam and known for his great character. And what he said was, we're in a greater need for a little bit of adab, which is etiquette and how to deal with people, than a great deal of knowledge. And we see that in our community sometimes. And it doesn't matter whether it's an Islamic community or whether it's, a professor in your classes. They have all this knowledge, but they don't know how to deliver it to you. And they don't know how to connect to you as a human being. And sometimes they're very rude about it. And everybody knows those professors because everybody says, don't take him or her because, you won't like her, she's nasty, or whatever the rumors go around about how they are. And, within our religion, and we consider what the laws say or what our expectations are in Islam versus what people practically do, it has a lot to do with our etiquette and our adab. And we go back to our responsibility as Muslims in upholding social justice and the preservation of all these things, the family, the economy, religion, life. When those things start to break down, that's when you start to see social injustice. When you start to see poverty on the rise, that's when you start to see all these social problems rising up as well. When you see the families breaking down, there are all these statistics about children growing up without fathers and how they're like so much more likely to go to prison, to not graduate high school, and all these other things. When you start seeing life being lost, then people start thinking very selfishly, like, how do I protect me and mine? And you stop worrying about your next door neighbor and other people around you. And so we need to consider that the little knowledge that we have and the little knowledge that I have, that we can apply that in a way that is socially responsible and that upholds social justice, not just in the Muslim community, and not just in America, but also in the world at large. And you see it when it happens. Like Egypt, when this thing happened, this revolution happened, everybody in the world was celebrating it. Muslims, non-Muslims, because as Muslims, we have it, as human beings, we have it in our heart. We believe as Muslims that there's a fitra, there's some things that you have in your heart, that you have in your soul, that you know when it's right and you know when it's wrong. And there's a hadith of the Prophet where someone came and asked him about something. He says, it's in here. He points to his heart. And so there are a lot of things like that. And so may Allah guide us all and help us in being just to our friends, to our families, to our neighbors, and all of society. Thank you very much. Okay, so he's asking a question of how, he's from Kenya, you said, right? Gentleman's from Kenya, and he said in Somalia you see a lot of injustices, especially towards women. And, one of the things that we have within religion is this concept of applying local culture, what is good, right? And unfortunately, sometimes when you have a society like that, like I said, where only one lung is breathing, and you don't have any women, throughout the greatness of Islamic history, you had women who were also involved in teaching Islam, and they were scholars of the religion. And you had this other whole part of society that was able to speak up for themselves. But throughout history, what you find, like, for example, the concept of the full niqab, covered from head to toe, that was something that was developed, that was a Persian tradition, okay? And so, when it went to Persia, that was a local custom, and the concept of veiling or modesty within Islam, they felt like, okay, well, that still applies to that, so we'll continue to do that tradition. And a lot of that spread throughout the Muslim world. A lot of scholars will disagree with whether that's required or not. And there are still some things established in Sharia law. For example, in a lot of these countries, like the cutting off of a hand for stealing, and the stoning for adultery, and all these other concepts. And, all I can say is that in some of these cases, it is just social injustice. There's no other way to word it. I mean, it's like in Afghanistan when they weren't educating women, right? I think 90% of Muslims in the world would disagree with that. Okay, but there's a small portion of our society where what happens is, some people would argue that Islam is in some countries also operating without one leg or one lung. I mean, in that there's the law, and then there's the spiritual sciences. Okay, and so some people would say that what happened, because I'm trying to give you not go into too much detail here. So some people would say is that once people started pushing out the spiritual sciences, they started losing touch with that concept of what's right and wrong. And so then they just start applying the law blanketly without considering local custom, without considering what's right or wrong. You know, because it's never just black and white, right, in a lot of these situations. So when it comes to a lot of these things that happen in Muslim countries, you know, we don't really have the answers for that, because a lot of times there's a political there's a political aspect to it, there's a cultural aspect to it. There's the other concept a lot of people bring up is female circumcision, right? And that was something that was never practiced traditionally in Islam, but in some countries where Islam went, some societies it was practiced there, and then certain people get in positions of power, and they decide that this continues to be a good idea. And so a lot of these things are very unfortunate, but again, it's some of the illnesses, and you can consider a lot of these places too. When I talk about these things falling apart, like the concepts of Sharia, what it's meant to preserve, and these things falling apart, a lot of these countries have a lot of social ills, and so then you see morality falling apart as well. You see that in our own country, in areas where there's lots of poverty, where there's the absence of the breakdown of the family, and those are things. You see a lot of things going on in those communities as well, which you can't say it's because of that community, it's because of those people in that community, it's because a lot of times the conditions that they live in, and then they make poor choices as a result. So, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, last part of it. This is about Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
Saudi Arabia could be considered as part of the heart of Muslim, just as Rome would be considered the heart of Christianity. But Saudi Arabia, women are not supposed to drive cars.
Yeah.
Is that part of the culture or is it part of the religion?
Yeah, I think it's part of the culture. I mean, there's nothing in Islam that doesn't allow women to drive a car. If you look in this country, if you look in any Western country, you have, it's a patriarchal society, and I think you have a lot of those problems in patriarchal societies, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim. The oppression of women, that's unfortunate. And there are even some safeguards in that regard in our religion that are supposed to help protect women, look out for them. Like the woman's, one of the things that Islam established was the woman's ability to ask for a divorce, to get a divorce. And in a lot of Muslim countries, unfortunately, they can't do that. And that's a sad reality, but it shouldn't be the case. Okay, yes.
You spoke a lot about social justice from within Muslims, so like a man and his wife or one and their neighbor. How would you explain Muslims' duty in terms of to those who are not Muslim? Is there any kind of difference there? Do you have more of an obligation to a Muslim brother or sister versus somebody who isn't Muslim?
Yeah. Think about that for a minute. I don't think so. I think your obligations are different sometimes. Like, for example, your obligation to a Muslim brother or sister to do, to do what's right. If you see them doing something wrong, correct them within the religion. Obligations to establish them or invite them to prayer. I think, of course, I'm not a Islamic scholar by any means, not even close. But, I don't understand it to be different. A lot of what we're told to do is, and even in the Quran, it uses the word humanity, mankind, or it's translated in different ways. And like when it talks about saving the life of another human being, it doesn't say Muslim, it doesn't say another believer even, it just says humanity. So a lot of our obligations are towards humanity and establishing what's right. And when Islam moved into a lot of different areas, Muslims even had a responsibility to protect the non-Muslims living within their kingdom. And there's a story of a Muslim ruler who basically what they collect taxes, right? So it's like, okay, as your Muslim ruler, every non-Muslim pays taxes to us, and for that we do certain things for you, right? One of them is to protect you. It's kind of like we pay taxes to our local governments, the same concept. And there was one time where the Muslims were about to get invaded, and this ruler, and I apologize, I don't remember who it was, actually started to give money back to the non-Muslims, saying that I don't think I'm going to be able to protect you because this army that's coming may overwhelm us. So I want to give you back my obligation to you, right? Because I don't know that I'm going to be able to do that for you. I'm going to try. So, there's examples like that throughout Muslim history of the best rulers where they showed an obligation to non-Muslims as well, and not just their brothers or sisters in Islam. Yes.
In Islam, is there a concept of if you don't do anything about oppression, it is an act of oppression? And if so, are we held accountable if you turn a blind eye and don't do anything about any injustices?
Yes, there is, and I've heard it before, but I can't repeat it for you. I'm sorry for that. But yeah, there is the concept. That's what, kind of like I said, we have an obligation to stand up against oppressive rulers, and so that's why, and I can't remember if it's hadith or if it's in the Quran, but and somebody probably can help me out with this. There's probably some people more knowledgeable about me than me about the Quran, but a people that Allah God will not change the condition of people until they change themselves, right? And so I think that concept also talks about how if we allow ourselves to be ruled by tyrannical leaders, maybe that implies something about ourselves, that we're accepting that as a norm for our society. Maybe that implies an illness within ourselves. And so, and there is that concept of our responsibility to stand up against oppression when we see it. Now, one of the things I have to talk about in marriage counseling with a lot of young men is that you have a responsibility in your house to stand up against oppression, especially, or even if it's your parents against your wife, right? You have the responsibility to respect your parents, but you don't have the responsibility to accept them oppressing your wife. And that happens sometimes because culturally, again, going back to the culture, in some of our cultures, unfortunately, it's just the tradition. And so it harms the relationship tremendously. So, yeah, we do have that obligation, and I'm sorry that I can't give you text to support that. That's my understanding. Any other questions? Okay.